In this session, we will explore some of the issues where health consumers can have an input onto helping to shape a healthier WA. We'll be joined by Ainsley Sartori from Cancer Council WA, and we'll share some links to the current consultation underway by the WA Department of Planning into the rules that agree the planning environment.
So thanks again to Claire for inviting me to come along to speak to you all today. As I mentioned, I'm the Obesity Prevention Manager at Cancer Council WA. I've only been in this role about 7 weeks now. Prior to that, I was the Obesity Policy Coordinator. Before I start, I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as Claire mentioned, we had been chatting about the planning laws and how there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between planning laws and public health. So today I just wanted to speak to you about how the planning laws are potentially a powerful tool to influence health, but how currently the WA Public Health Act puts the sort of impetus on local governments to promote health in their local area, but WA planning laws don't allow for health to be considered when planning applications are put forward for review. So there's a absolute disconnect there. I'm also going to touch on some of the other work that Cancer Council has been doing with our partners to advocate for some changes to the planning laws and highlighting this issue, such as submissions to government, such as the one that Claire has mentioned. So consultations and submissions, oppositions to fast food outlet applications, and a policy brief that we've done to ministers. So I'll just move along. I'll just give you a little bit of background and context to this issue. So this is probably stuff most people know, but puts everything into perspective. So on average, we know that 35% of the energy Australian adults consume every day comes from discretionary foods. So those foods like cakes, confectionery, sugary drinks, and this proportion is even higher for children. So with 41% of the food that 14 to 18-year-olds consume coming from those types of food. And we also know that there's studies that show that the density of fast food outlets and the proximity to these food outlets has an influence on food purchasing and consumption. So, for example, a higher proportion of healthy food outlets obviously will increase the consumption of those foods, such as fruit and vegetables, whereas conversely, we know that people living in areas of greater disadvantage can have a poorer access to healthy food outlets and experience poorer health outcomes. And so the influence of our built environment, so where we live and planning, can facilitate or inhibit those health behaviours like physical activity, healthy eating, and this means that these planning laws are a very powerful tool to influence our health and therefore reduce obesity and the impact of obesity. So the pervasive marketing and availability, as Claire mentioned, of unhealthy food and drinks is actually the single biggest driver of overweight and obesity in Australia. A few years ago, the WA government set an ambitious goal, which was to halt the rise in obesity by 2025 and to have the greatest percentage of our population with a healthy weight of all Australian states by 2029. And as part of this goal, the Sustainable Health Review actually recommended that changes to the planning laws be made, which would limit unhealthy food outlets and support access to healthy food options. So let's just take a look at some recent planning decisions that have actually run counter to these public health concerns. So in May of last year, approval was granted for a second McDonald's store in Albany, and this store, I don't know if people on the chat know Albany well, but this one's on the corner of La Grande Avenue and Albany Highway, which is less than a kilometre from the North Albany Senior High School and directly opposite Albany TAFE. And more recently, in August of last year, McDonald's put in another application for a second McDonald's in Ellenbrook. And this proposed development was planned directly opposite Averley Secondary College. And you can see on the map that I've got on my slide that the site marked X is the proposed site of the McDonald's, and the arrow points to the high school, which is directly opposite that McDonald's. And we know from studies that the availability of fast food chains appears to be a key driver of school students' discretionary food purchasing from outlets near their school. Then more recently, we've had another planning decision, which was for 7 fast food outlets in Ellenbrook. So again, up in Ellenbrook. And this was for the first Taco Bell to open in Perth, one in Midland and one in Ellenbrook. And along with that Taco Bell, there was going to be, well, the plan was to put in another a KFC standalone, and also another section of shops, 5 fast food outlets in the same area. So in response to that particular application, Cancer Council and our partners, the Telethon Kids Institute and the WA School Canteen Association and the Heart Foundation, prepared a written submission opposing this application. Again, along with this one and the 2 previous ones I mentioned on my earlier slide, our opposition fell pretty much on deaf ears, because although existing planning laws prevent decision makers from considering health outcomes when reviewing these applications, we still wanted to call on these particular local governments just to have consideration of these public health outcomes and the impact that their decisions were going to be making on their communities. And we wanted these decision makers to engage in a process which gave due weight to the real risks to the community that these particular applications were proving to have. But ultimately, the decision makers in each of these decisions concluded that that there was nothing that they could actually do according to in accordance with the planning laws. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we strongly opposed all these applications, and particularly the one in Albany, we received quite a lot of media attention about it. And you can see on the left just the efforts that the McDonald's go to encourage and promote their store by promoting it to families. I mean, what kid's not going to want to go to a 5-story playground at the local McDonald's, of course. So that's what brings the families in. So in the particular case of the Averley application, which I was mentioning before, the Averley Secondary College, we actually asked our colleague from UWA Law School to attend the decision-making, the panel that was making the decision. And Averley Secondary College also sent along their deputy principal, because they were obviously equally concerned about this particular McDonald's, given it was opposite their school. I mean, not only for the health outcomes for their students, but potential behavioural outcomes, potential for kids leaving the school. Obviously, it would create extra demands on staff, having to monitor the kids, be at the gates, making sure they weren't running across the McDonald's, or even, as has happened in other cases, the staff, they've actually had to put on extra staff. McDonald's have asked the school to put on extra staff to monitor the behaviour of the kids who were obviously, had such access to the McDonald's that they were spending so much time there and running a little bit riot. So we put in an opposition, the school put in an opposition, mainly due to the fact that Ellenbrook, we made the point, Ellenbrook already has an existing McDonald's, a Hungry Jack's, a Chicken Treat, KFC, Red Rooster, Domino's, Nando's, and numerous other non-chain fast food outlets and dining outlets, which suggested to us that there was this proposed development didn't need to meet any consumer requirement or demand. They already had a lot of these outlets in the suburb. And the City of Swan actually received 311 public submissions, and this is something that we can discuss afterwards, is how we can make submissions as individuals. So during the advertising period, and 216 of these submissions expressed objection on numerous issues, so not just health, but waste, traffic management, parking. And then following the written submissions, the planning application was put forward to this particular panel, which is where Meredith Blake from UWA attended on our behalf. Meredith reported back, and this story I repeat frequently because it breaks my heart, because this associate or deputy principal made an oral submission on behalf of the school, and she was, according to Meredith, extremely emotional because she felt like she had to stand up on behalf of her students because no one else was standing up for them. The local government certainly wasn't, and the planning decision makers were not. And she made the point that the kids would actually be able to smell the cooks chipping from inside their classrooms, and that story really breaks my heart, because these kids need protecting from this sort of these tactics that these fast food outlets employ, which is to build these outlets near schools. So the panel actually went 3-2 in favour of the application, and the two that argued against the application going forward were incredibly conscious of the failure of the planning laws, which consider planning applications in a silo when they should be considered holistically alongside health and education and other concerns. So that decision and that similar decision in Albany highlighted to us that the decision makers at this level and higher levels should be able to consider factors beyond the direct process that they have to consider when they're looking at these planning applications, and that the regulatory requirements are being met. Just move along. So in light of those decisions, we actually again spoke to our colleague at UWA Law School, Meredith Blake, and we were using some funding that we'd received from Healthway to commission these rapid research projects that Claire mentioned at the beginning. We got Meredith to do some research, which was basically looking at doing some desktop research to look at what the planning laws actually said and how they prevent local governments from being able to implement the Public Health Act, because the Public Health Act obviously puts this impetus on local governments to consider health. And then we also asked her to consider what other opportunities there could be to amend the planning laws, which would enable local governments to further this public health consideration. And then how could local governments be best supported? Do they need further training? And how could they be supported to be equipped to make these planning decisions, which come before them quite frequently? So this bit's a bit dry, I apologise, but that's law for you, and I can say that because I used to be a lawyer. So the current law states, so this is the Public Health Act 2016, and the Public Health Act's main purpose is the promotion of health and wellbeing, and public health is defined as the health of individuals in the context of the wider health and wellbeing of the community, with the combined safeguards, policies and programs to protect, promote, improve the health of individuals and communities, and to prevent and reduce the incidence of illness and disability. So looking at that, you would think, right, well, how can we build a McDonald's opposite a high school? But we can, because the planning laws, there's a particular, again, sorry, this is so dry, but Schedule 2, Clause 7 of the local planning schemes provide there's a set of deemed provisions that apply automatically to local planning schemes, which are designed to promote decision-making processes and procedures. And there's a lack of any explicit requirement in this particular clause for local governments to consider how the proposed development could impact on public health. So what does this mean? It basically means that the laws don't align. And there's a problem with that, because it means, as I've been saying, that these particular applications can get through. So Meredith made a few recommendations about what could be done. She suggested that health could be included as a mandatory consideration under these local planning schemes, and that this should indicate the weight to which the consideration of health should be given. And also that should provide an inclusive, non-exhaustive list of matters that constitute community wellbeing. So we're not just considering this these particular recommendations factors that contribute to being by the health.
Could you try again?
Oh, sorry, my my Siri was just speaking to me from my phone. We're talking about things like promoting physical activity as well, and making sure there's plenty of shade so that people aren't exposed to UV. So it's not just these things like fast food outlets that should be considered in these planning decisions. And the other recommendation that Meredith made was that educational resources should be provided to these decision makers, because they really are not trained to consider these sort of matters when they come before them in these decision-making panels. So with all that, and with all the history of our applications, we produced a policy brief which set out what we believe that the state government should do in order to reform the planning laws so that specific public health outcomes could be considered, and that was presented to the Minister for Planning's ministerial department last year. And then these, I'm just finishing up here, these are some of the submissions that and consultations that have been open in the last few years. The Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage have been have had a wide range of consultations open over the last few years, and so we can discuss this afterwards, but we as Cancer Council and with many of our partners have been making submissions, just really pointing out that these these submissions and these discussion papers that come out of these should really factor in public health, which a lot of them don't when we're presented with discussion papers, such as last year there was this discussion paper or draft operational policy, which you can see on the screen, planning for school sites. And so this is brand new schools in brand new areas. And there's no consideration in that for junk food outlets. So, for instance, it said school sites shouldn't be planned near petrol stations or liquor outlets or industrial sites, but it didn't say schools shouldn't be planned near fast food outlets. So we put in our submission that should also be a consideration. And I'm just about done. Yes, I am done. So I'll leave it there, but I'm really happy to chat further and answer any questions or make suggestions as to how people can get further involved in these sort of things. So I will now unshare my screen.
So if that has motivated you to be involved, then please check out some of these links on both the Health Consumers Council website, the Cancer Council WA website, and also the Healthy Active by Design website. The deadline for the consultation is the 31st of August, and we've included the links where you can go and find out more about that. But if you'd like to stay in touch with Health Consumers Council on this topic, there are some links here in this last slide. So we look forward to joining with you in advocating for a healthier WA.